And I would ask that to you regarding your faith too. What's your relationship going to be like this year, whether or not you feel in love with God right now? That doesn't matter as much. But as you think intentionally about that new year, what's that going to be made up of? I don't know if you've heard of a man named George Barna before. This should just kind of in. He is probably more responsible than anyone for providing data on the spiritual climate of our country. Does all kinds of, tens of thousands of bits of data collected every year that he condenses down. And for this whole past year, just last week, he kind of sent out this thing in which he pulled out the main themes of 2006 on a spiritual level of what's going on in America. He takes out maybe 3 or 4 different high points out of this. And this is what he says. This is his third major theme. He says, if people's faith is objectively measured against a biblical standard of how faith is to be practiced, Americans are spiritually lukewarm. Now, I might sense that or feel that, but he's got the data to support that. Americans are spiritually lukewarm. This is what he says. Very limited effort is devoted to spiritual growth. Most Americans experience accidental spiritual growth, since there is generally no plan or process other than showing up at a church and absorbing a few ideas here and there. Even then, few people have a defined understanding of what they are hoping to become as followers of Christ. And so we attribute much of that to the many distractions that we have in our lives. I guess for you, what's 2007 going to be? Are you content to let that describe you? That you would be a product of accidental spiritual growth? Or do you want to see something a little bit different? And this God who promises that He will give His people a heart to know Him, does that somehow possibly apply to you? Could that not just be promised to somebody else in this book called the Bible, but could there be a specific application to you too? Is God going to have a hand in this? Well, let's take a look. I want to open your Bibles tonight. Jeremiah. There's some Bibles in boxes here. And I just want to look at this one section here tonight. Jeremiah 24. Just kind of pass those around the room. Now, some of you may not have spent much time in the Bible at all, or specifically the book of Jeremiah. But if you kind of open the middle of the Bible and just kind of head right, there's some big books in there: Psalms, Proverbs, Isaiah. Jeremiah is the next after Isaiah. But we're reading Jeremiah 24. Now, there is a very specific historical context here. There's a very specific story in which this promise was made, Jeremiah 24, verse 7. And the very first phrase of verse 1 kind of lays that out. It's one of those phrases that you just kind of have to read and then take a deep breath. So, it's got some tough words in there. Let me read this little first phrase for you. After Jehoiakim, son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. And notice that, Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim. The George Foreman book of baby names was used here. Just one letter off here. Well, these two kings, the officials, the artisans, the other skilled workers of Judah, they were carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Comma. What? Alright, so here it is. This nation of Israel, there's a southern kingdom called Judah. The capital city is called Jerusalem. And there's been this period of hundreds of years in which the prophets of God have been warning the people. It's like, hey, what? You've lost your first love. Kind of what I was talking about before is things shift. And he says, you've forsaken your first love. Remember how when you were young, you followed me, you were in love with me, just like a bride is in love? That's how you were, Israel. Come back, return to how things were. Well, they didn't listen. They kept after their own way. They didn't return to God. And so he kept warning and warning and warning. Finally, it's time for the consequence. And so they're carried out. And it wasn't just everybody, but it was the officials, the artisans, the skilled workers, everybody that this empire of Babylon saw as being of value. And they took these people off, carted them off into Babylonian captivity. It was a 70-year period. So there's kind of this period of judgment and difficulty for this nation. Well, here's what happens. Jeremiah is a prophet. During this time, the word of the Lord comes to him, and there's this object lesson. And then it's 2 baskets of figs. That's really kind of a lesson of figs. One basket has good figs in it. The kind he says that ripen early. The other basket had figs that were so bad you couldn't even eat them. And then God says to Jeremiah, he says, what do you see? Jeremiah describes it. He says, well, I see these 2 baskets of figs. God says exactly. Now let me tell you what that means. And here we pick up in verse 4. Thank you. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Like these good figs, I regard as good the exiles from Judah, whom I sent away from this place to the land of the Babylonians. My eyes will watch over them for their good, and I will bring them back to this land. I will build them up and not tear them down. I will plant them and not uproot them. I will give them, here it is, a heart to know me, that I am the Lord. They will be my people, and I will be their God, for they will return to me with all their heart. Now, if you know anything about kind of that code language in the Old Testament, what those words are, when God says, I will be their God, they will be my people, that is the Old Agreement, or the Old Testament. That's the covenant that is reflected all through the Old Testament. God says, I will be their God, they will be my people. That's His agreement. That's God acting. And so He's returning back to His promise or His covenant. He's saying, these people, even though they're in extreme difficulty, they're away from the place of their land, their culture, everything else, they're a long ways away. He says, yeah, even in the middle of this, I'm watching out for them. And He calls this the basket of good figs. Now there's this other basket, as for the bad figs, so bad they cannot be eaten. So will I deal with Zedekiah. Now he's the current king that follows these other two, Jehoiakim. I got Zedekiah. And he throws into his officials the survivors from Jerusalem, whether they remain in this land or live in Egypt. I will make them abhorrent and an offense to all the kingdoms of the earth, a reproach and a byword, a curse and an object of ridicule, wherever I banish them. I will send the sword, famine, and plague against them until they are destroyed from the land I gave to them and their ancestors. So which basket of figs would you rather find yourself in? Simple answer, right? Now, in essence, here's the difference. Those who were in the basket of good figs submitted to what God was doing in their lives, both taking the good and the bad. And these people, even in Babylon, their hearts were breaking. They were saying, God, we've sinned. Bring us back. We want you to keep working with us. God, we're sorry. And that's what marked them. They submitted to what God was doing. And although it looked really difficult, they still said, God, you're in control. You know best. Bring this back around for us. And even in that place, God says to them, I will give you a heart to know me. And what characterized the bad figs is, rather than asking God that He would supply them, they say, we're going to supply ourselves. There's a passage earlier in the book of Jeremiah in which God is talking about the people, kind of characterizing them. And He says, you have forsaken me, the living water, and have dug for yourselves cisterns. And yet you do not understand that they are broken, they cannot hold water. God's saying, I would have supplied you everything that you needed. I'm the living water, and yet you didn't want that. You dug for yourself cisterns, which are just basically holding tanks in the rock. And yet you don't understand they're weak. They're never going to make you happy. You're never going to be satisfied by that. I don't know, you might be at a spot in life like that right now. Life's hard sometimes, and you know, when you go through that difficult period of time, you might just get to the point where you say, God, if this is how you're going to take care of me, I'll take care of myself. If this is what it's going to feel like when you're in control, then I'll be in control. And that is such a common response for us, because we see this much of it. And yet in that, there's this heart that breaks, and we say, God, I don't understand everything, but I still trust you. I still want you to be in charge. Just flip over to chapter 26 for a minute. Why were these people characterized as the bad figs? Well, look at their reaction to Jeremiah's words. This is in verse 8. But as soon as Jeremiah finished telling all the people everything the Lord had commanded him to say, the priests, the prophets, and all the people seized him and said, you must die. Why do you prophesy in the Lord's name that this is what's going to happen to us if we go on this track? Even now, as God is warning them, they're saying, we don't want to hear it, God. And even in this moment, they're saying, no, God, we want control. Well, Jeremiah says, if only you would just turn. Even now, God will hear your cry. And in these verses that follow, he lays it out. If you obey the Lord, if you submit to Him, He will still act. Let me just ask you a question then. If you had to just place yourself right now in one of these two baskets of figs, I'm not just saying which one you want to be in, but based on those descriptions, which one are you in?